Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by Joshua Phillip Johnson, author of The Forever Sea. This startling, unique fantasy novel takes place in a water-scarce world completely covered by endless vegetation, where, instead of oceans, magically powered ships sail seas of miles-tall prairie grass. Kindred Greyreach is a sailor and young apprentice hearthfire keeper, using fire and bone-fueled magic to power a harvesting vessel. But Kindred's deep understanding of the fire's own mystic language is unique among keepers, as is her creative, impulsive, and sometimes dangerous approach to solving problems. Kindred learns that her estranged grandmother, a venerable ship's captain and hearthkeeper, willingly stepped off her own boat and disappeared into the vast sea. But she learns that what appears to be suicide may have been her grandmother's quest to discover something hidden in the depths below. Chasing her grandmother's cryptic legacy forces Kindred to the center of a cultural water war, pushes her past safe seas to a mythic pirate city, and drives her to battle with great beasts of the deep. But will the answers she seeks be worth the sacrifice of everything she loves, her ship, her found family, a life sailing under the sun, or does madness await in the endless dark depths? The Forever Sea is a debut fantasy novel and first in the series of the same name, available January 19th from DAW Books. And Josh, welcome to Fictitious.
Thanks for having me here.
So, by way of context, and because we've talked about this before the actual interview got started, we are recording this at a moment that they always say you'll always remember where you were when something happened. So I'll always know that I shared the moment where insurgents took over our nation's capital in the middle of a violent uprising by white supremacists, but I got to share that moment with Joshua Phillip Johnson. So what a cool thing we get to do together is we get to talk about books while the country falls apart. And
I'll certainly remember it. Yeah.
By the time this airs, who knows what anything looks like. So we have to basically just proceed like the world still turns and the country still exists after we get done with this conversation. But in the meantime, we're going to take a beat and head off to an extremely different world, like I described at the top. Like I mentioned, I mean, this is a very, very different fantasy world from anything I've encountered before. And the only way I was describing this to my wife earlier, and the only way I could think to say it was, well, it's like water world, but like the other way around. But except for you would think that would be desert, and instead, no, it's just all plants. But that same kind of like a world dominated by a specific natural phenomenon, which in this case is a world covered in grasses. What do you use for your elevator pitch for this novel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to use what you said now going forward because that's very good. I've done it a couple of different ways. So I've described it in the past as Mad Max meets Pirates of the Caribbean, but on grass instead of sand or water. It's hard to describe though, because it is such a different setting and such a weird setting to describe. I've had a lot of people say like, so is the grass like a metaphorical sea? And I have to say, no, it's a literal sea. So yeah, my best sort of elevator pitch is imagine a miles high, endless sea of grasses that most people simply sail across and don't think much of. And there's a woman who starts to wonder what's below, which ends up separating her from a lot of the people around her and pushing her to some pretty serious extremes.
I mean, I like everything that you said there, and especially with the volume of sci-fi and fantasy stuff that comes across my bow. One of the things that I'm always looking at is that we're always building off the context from other stories that we've encountered, and I mean that's the nature of storytelling. But it's rare to encounter something where you stop and go, oh man, I really don't think I've encountered that before. And that's really the way I felt in this. And so getting that level of surprise and finding something that feels this different, I think is a unique snowflake in a world of amazing fiction, and extremely refreshing. And I really want to dig into the nuts and bolts of it, because what you've done with the world building here introduces lots of questions and complications and tremendous amounts of work on your part to make function. But I'm going to swing it back around to that stuff and talk about light stuff like themes. Thematically, there's clearly some coming of age stuff going on here with Kindred, because you do have kind of the young upstart who does things her own way, and how that brashly comes into conflict with some of the world around her. There is found family. Clearly, there is a big conservation and environmental aspect going on in this story as well. I'm curious if, as you set out to tell this story, as this idea first germinated in your mind, did some of this stuff, was it kind of in there from the beginning? Was there things that you felt like you wanted to talk about and say? What things developed over time? What did that look like for you in the development journey for this novel?
Well, first, thanks for saying those nice things about the premise and the world. It is hard in a genre like this that feels so flooded with like really crazily awesome ideas to find something new. I mean, I think we're at such an exciting time right now in, genre fiction publishing. And so, yeah, it's great. For me, I think a lot of those themes were there at the start. A lot of the books that I've glommed onto and TV shows and movies often have found family. And I'm sure there are deep psychological reasons for that. And those things I won't go into because maybe my actual family will listen to this. I don't know. So some of that stuff was there. I really wanted to write a book primarily, I think, about a sort of overlooked or kind of lost landscape. The prairie used to cover so much of the United States. And I've read sort of old accounts that talk about it in this really sort of fantastical way, right? I remember this account that said something like grass is tall enough to obscure a man on horseback, right? Which is just sort of like unthinkable to me in lots of ways. I think this landscape has been mostly lost, right? It's now just little postage stamps of existence in sort of little sort of reserves around the United States. But I think it's also the kind of thing that is really beautiful and really diverse, but seems sort of from a distance to be quite plain and boring. And so I think that is a really great microcosm for a lot of the problems that have led to things like, overconsumption of natural resources and climate change and this sort of thing, right? A sort of growing lack or a sort of slow degrading of sort of our appreciation for what seems to be a boring part of the world. And so these themes of like conservation and scarcity and resource management kind of sprung out of that little initial seed.
I think also when you talk about things like found family, that is clearly a thematic, but also I think kind of gets categorized as trope a lot these days. Yeah. And a thing that's increasingly become a conversation on this show is kind of like trope can be a dirty word, or it can be your favorite word, depending on where you come from in fandom, where you come from in marketing and exposure in the book world. I'm curious for you, how much you're aware of trope while constructing things, both as a reader, as a writer, and how that came into play. Like, did you have moments where you thought, oh, I'm hitting a button that I know a readership will be into? Or is that one of those things that you find out after the fact when your editor's like, oh, you did the trope? And you're like, I don't know.
I wish I could say I was totally in control and knew what I was doing and I was pressing those buttons really intentionally. I think probably more accurate is that, I've been a reader for my whole life, and I think you internalize a lot of that stuff as a reader. And the more you read, the more kind of intuitive that stuff becomes. And so, I also teach creative writing at the university. And one of the things that I tell students a lot is I can give you craft books and we can talk in class about how to do this or that. But I think really the best teacher is just reading as much as you can and reading everything that you can and internalizing and making intuitive a lot of these ideas. And so I think about tropes sometimes, but I think I do it much more as a reader than I do as a writer. I think there's a kind of trope of like the kind of rough on the outside, but heart of gold sort of character that I am quite fond of. And I didn't think about that much when I was making my characters, but it's like obviously there. Yeah, I think that stuff is sort of littered throughout. And yeah, I wish I had been maybe more intentional with some of it.
That's an interesting note that, you teach creative writing. So I think trying to stay on top of like just what the conversation is as you're thinking about writing, but also about industry, about the the world of publishing and what fiction looks like. I mean, it's ever evolving. Certainly today's markets look very different as far as, what the traditional publishing wants versus indie publishing versus genre and like all that different stuff. So there's always that difference between the casual reader, who's the person who picks a book off the shelf and just reads a book and doesn't necessarily go digging for everybody else's viewpoints of something. They just experience it on their own. And then you have the highly connected, very online crowd who have a completely different experience of something that is not only informed by just the public conversation and also an extreme addiction to story and books, but also because it becomes a social experience, because it's a thing that they share, whether it's the hype over something, the people are jumping in on Goodreads and throwing out 5-star reviews for their favorite author before a book is, 6 months ahead of it even coming out, because they're on the hype train. It's just such a different experience. So we could probably do a whole episode just talking about the teaching of things, but that's going back to the setting. Like I said, a world of water scarcity, because there aren't oceans. There's this, this huge body of plant life that everybody sails around. And so you're in a water collection kind of society. There are also wells and things too. Can you kind of just get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of like what structurally this looks like? What are the inhabitable spaces? What lurks below that, that we hear people talking about? Like, what is this world like to live in?
So this is a thing that I explored a little bit in sort of various rounds of edits and was really helped, I think, by editors a lot on this one. So I think once you start thinking about scarcity in this way for something that's so essential like water, it starts to affect everything, right? And so it goes from like the kinds of plants that you can harvest to like when you do your activities. So most of the activities that happen in this world happen at night because it's usually cooler. You try and stay inside and sort of conserve energy. There's a book that does a really good job of this called The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. It's like totally fantastic in lots of ways. And one of the things that he's really interested in is like characters are always thinking about like calories, right? Because you can only get so many calories in a day. And so it starts to affect everything. And so I was thinking like if water becomes this sort of key thing, suddenly its value sort of rises, of course, but also your body becomes a kind of liability. And so you're always looking to sort of mitigate the potential overuse of your own resource, which is you, right? The book primarily takes place, at least at the start, on an island called Arcadia. And the water problem is especially bad there because it's so remote from other places. And so it's hard to ship in water. And this is, of course, a problem that we've seen around the world. And I think we'll continue to see grow around the world as climate problems increase. I was really interested in like what a localized, really terrible sort of resource specific problem looks like. And so, yeah, it's stuff like you try and conserve movement, you drink different things, or, maybe you don't drink alcohol because it's going to dehydrate you. And so you find other ways to have a good time or whatever, right? It's in everything, right? It becomes a primary trading point. There are sort of religions that grow up around it in the same way that I think religious fervor can grow up around other things that people see as necessary. And so, yeah, it's everything, right? It has to be everything.
Yeah, it becomes the idiom of the story in a lot of ways, because there is no part of the characters' lives that are not touched by that scarcity, by that nature of the world. And upon like just first arriving in Arcadia, like you were talking about there, getting to see that, politically, the control of supply and demand is a big deal, just exactly like it would be, in any situation where you have a valuable resource. I mean, for us for a long time, that's been oil, in the real world, and will become water and already is in a lot of places. There's essentially a politician, a senator, who's like locking down control over water and a lot of other sort of protection rights and stuff. Like it's very much the politics that we know well. It's also very much kind of the sort of mafioso protection schemes. And it's a massive manipulation. It becomes the us versus them problem over something that people can control, and by that control their people. It's terrifying to read because there's enough of that in there that feels like super fantastical world, but like not far enough off for comfort for sure. I felt like as you were putting this thing together, and you mentioned doing your own kind of like some research and inspirations and some of that. When you are constructing a world this different, there's a lot of heavy work to be done on the technical side to make those things consistent. I always look at like if you write a novella, or you write a short story, you can throw out a premise and it just needs to barely hang together, right? You just have to get to the end of that short word count, and as long as it holds, you're fine. But the longer a story goes on, the more it has to justify its own existence, the more it needs to make sense. And this is, what about a 500-page novel? Like, so that is a great deal more stuff that you have to make work. So I'm curious from both the technical end, as far as your notes, your research, your organization, how you kept that stuff going, what editorial played in that process, keeping things consistent and making sure it worked, how you did that. And then also kind of want to know how you approached story pacing, because inevitably you have info dumps, you have things you have to explain about the world so the audience has some idea of what's going on, because context always matters. So yeah, how did you handle those things?
Yeah, badly, I think often. Info, info dumps are, I think, are a challenge for me. As a reader, I don't mind info dumps all that much because I'm often really curious about the world. And so getting them often feels like answering questions that I had, right? And so I think the challenge then for authors is sort of planting those questions for readers early enough so that the info dump feels somewhat relevant. I don't know that I always do such a great job of that, but it's what I strived for often. But yeah, in terms of pacing, I tried to think of it in kind of rises and falls, as I think a lot of authors do. And so there's a real value, I think, in terms of pacing to have a slowdown after a big action heavy scene. I think readers like having those scenes to kind of sit with the fallout of whatever just happened, to kind of reflect a little bit before you move on to the next thing. And I think those can often be places for sort of info dumps or sort of sliding in little bits of information. I tried to think about Kindred's POV and think about like, what wouldn't she know? And so could I have characters around her who could be supplying that information via dialogue, which always feels a little bit snappier to me than just having a narrator sort of plop some information on the page. That's how I tried to handle info dumps and sort of pacing. In terms of world building, it was a ton of work and a lot of drafts. It's a thing that I really struggle with. And so my first draft didn't hang together logically at all, I would say. In the second draft, I tried to stitch a little bit more in and then a little bit more in. And even by the time we were at the editorial phase and working with editors, they were still saying like, okay, but this doesn't make any sense if water is actually as scarce as you say it is, or, but I thought the distance was this far, or, but how would that actually work? And so, I think for me, I am bad at thinking through all of those various ramifications of things. And so, having a team of people who are better readers than me constantly saying, you forgot about this, or what about this, was how I did it. So I tried to do a bulk of research right away and then sort of backfill as questions came up.
I think one of the great challenges of genre fiction, particularly science fiction and fantasy, is that they introduce big, powerful, interesting, world-breaking concepts that every once in a while tie the writer down with huge problems. And inevitably, whether it's you introduce the magic MacGuffin that can do too much, like grant all the wishes in the world, or or something as simple as can make any tool that you need at any given time, you're going to run into problems where that doesn't work. Alex E. Harrow was on the show a while back talking about 10,000 Doors of January, and talked about how like, oh, her character, as long as she has pen and paper, can write kind of any solution she needs into existence. So the second half of her novel, which is her just going, oh God, I can't let her have a pen or any way to write anything. And that's a pretty big ask, right? So you're always having to be mindful of like, did I just do something cool that wrecks the rest of my story or wrecks the rest of my series? One of your publishing siblings, Cass Morris, was on just a while ago, and talking about like, we were talking about how prophecy is in her story and how that screwed her up in her second novel. So it's a challenge for everybody, but genre fiction, it's a real one.
Yeah, I mean, this is like particularly hitting home for me because I'm in the middle of working on the second book. And, I think first books in series are often about big promises that you can make. And it's so easy to make big promises. we could have a whole conversation about the TV show Lost and how promises maybe went off the rails in that series or didn't. But I think it's really easy to make promises, and it's so intoxicating, I think, for readers to see these big promises and think like, oh, I'm in for such a wild ride. I really hit that hard, I think, in the first book by sort of constantly alluding to this mystery of what's below the waves. And that's a big challenge because, it's hard to imagine, I think, for us today, such a sizable part of the world that we don't know anything about. And so I had to build in some sort of mythology and some sort of social reasoning why people tried to ignore or avoid what was below the waves. The whole thing is a sort of big promise from me to the reader about like, there's something interesting down there. And for most of the first book, I didn't really know what was down there. And so I'm sort of in the process of coming to terms with my own big promises.
I love that explanation of first novels. I mean, I think you really, really hit something big there, which is just that, yeah, like the first novel is a big promise. And I think a lot of first novels reach far, they swing hard. And we know that in the publishing industry, one of the big challenges right now is that a lot of readers, when they find out something is a series, they kind of shy back for a little bit until they wait for a couple more books to arrive. Clearly, there's a lot of people who are like super anxious to jump into new things and excited about it. But there is a once bitten, twice shy audience of people who have gotten a little worried about books that never arrived or, books that never, quite landed. I remember very well, I won't name it. There was a fantasy series, and this is going back probably 15 years ago, a series that came out with swinging with a really great first novel, bleak, but great. And it was supposed to be 4 novels, ended up being 3 because the author burnt out hard, and you could feel it by the end of the 3rd novel where it just didn't work anymore, and he just wanted to be done. It was tough to finish a series like that because you could see that like he swung hard and then was kind of whiffing by the end of it. Ideally, editorial and pacing and having a team behind you like can fix that problem. But the big promise is there, and you're making that promise to yourself as a writer that you can follow through on all of it. So it goes a lot of different directions. And I like that you brought that up. Another thing in here, you have this, the deep dark in the plants below, but you do have these other cities, one of which is this thing called the Once City. And I don't want to give away too much because this isn't a spoiler show. But, in stark contrast to what Arcadia is as this, kind of small center of commerce, but it's kind of off by itself, the Once City is this like sort of pirate haven and sort of this mythical place. So what can you tell us about that without, giving away too much?
I can tell you, I'll tell the myth of the Once City as it's known to characters in the beginning of the book, and readers can read on to figure out how much of the myth is actually true. So the myth of the Once City is that it's a sort of constantly moving, constantly roving city that sort of sails or shifts or whatever through the forever sea, unlike any of the other islands or land masses that people have been on. The only way to find the Once City is to have been there before. And so I sort of have like Tortuga in my mind as a sort of rough reference point. But I wanted this thing that had sort of grown to be a bigger myth in people's heads than it perhaps was in reality, and to be a thing that people could sort of hang stories on, right? I'm really interested in like cultural points where people decide to sort of leverage stories around. So famous figures or famous moments in time, the kinds of stories that we keep returning to, even though we don't have access to them, or they're really historically distant, or we don't actually know what happened. I'm really interested in these like little points where people can say, this is a thing that I want to keep sort of hanging meaning and story on. And so the Once City is one of these things. Pirates still exist in this world, and they kind of sail out of the horizon and attack and then disappear back into the horizon. And for various reasons, it's very difficult to chase them. And so it's sort of uncharted waters out there. I sort of spoke wrong maybe when I said like it's hard to imagine things on our world that we haven't discovered, because of course like we send people to space somewhat regularly. And, I thought a lot in this book about like what would make somebody go to space, right? Like, of course, there are technological benefits, and there are probably health benefits that we can sort of learn from all of the advances and things like this. But at its core, it seems like there has to be a kind of yearning for the unknown. And so I think a lot of people in this world look at these uncharted grasses and say, like, that is like too much for me. No, thank you. Like the danger levels are too high. But I think some people, as in our world, look at the unknown and say, I got to know what's out there, right? I got to know what's happening out there.
And then let's talk about the magic of this world.
Yeah.
Fantasy fans are always obsessed with magic systems. And this one, I mean, we're introduced to it very quickly. So we see right from the beginning, at least parts of it, because we see that Kindred is this person who uses this specific kind of magic in order to power the ship. And there's a prologue, and we'll talk about that later. And oh boy, do I love a good prologue. But when we get to Kindred in chapter 1, we start off basically with a chase. So we start right off with a bit of action. And I really like that because we get to see her under pressure. We get to see a group of people working together, and we get to see the magic working in its intended form, which is to power the ship, to get away from pirates, and that it's being done in tandem by these two different keepers, one of whom has a very traditional, very codified way of doing this thing, and then Kindred, who is very, very different. And it involves fire, and it has bones, which I think that's an interesting part of the world that we want to dig into as well. So what can you kind of tell me about magic in general in this world, how it powers these ships, what that means to Kindred, and then we can kind of circle back around and kind of talk about some of the other kind of mages of the world as well.
Yeah, for sure. So there are a couple of kind of interlocked magic systems, I think, in this world, but they all revolve around fire and burning things for sort of fuel. And so my kind of bigger, maybe heavy-handed metaphor is about like oil consumption, of course. I'm just taking sort of what becomes oil or gasoline and sort of going back a couple of steps and making them bones again. But it's roughly the same thing, right? And in this world, if you just sort of step out onto the sea, you'll fall, right? There's nothing holding you up. There's no buoyancy like there is in a water sea. And so I needed a way to keep ships afloat. Sort of, we were talking earlier about like getting around sort of big issues that you create for yourself. And so I needed a way to like prevent people from just kind of exploring the sea freely, right? I wanted there to be real danger and risk in this. And so every ship is outfitted with at least one hearthfire keeper, whose job it is to sort of maintain what's essentially like a big bonfire in the middle of a ship. And it's fed with bones, and the various positions and formations of these bones all impact how well a vessel sails, and how you deal with different kinds of winds and different kinds of waves and different kinds of speeds and things like that. I'm always really fascinated by how technical and super finicky sailboats can be, and how people are always like smoothing their sheets or their sails in various different ways and luffing for this. And there's like a whole language for sailboats that I am like only a little bit knowledgeable of. But I wanted a character whose job it was to essentially be the sort of engineer of the vessel, and to kind of constantly be fine-tuning the sort of output of this magic system to keep them afloat. But Kindred's difficulty, of course, is that she doesn't like to do kind of standard builds, and sort of she doesn't like to follow the sort of codified rules. She's a flunk out of the Hearthfire keeping school. She did not get along very well with the instructors there. And so her approach is a much more intuitive one. And she's paired up with somebody who is a real kind of stickler for the rules, which leads to its own kind of conflict. But at the end of the day, the magic system really comes down to the burning of things. And for the Hearthfire, the thing that keeps a ship afloat, it's bones, and specifically captain's bones.
Yeah, and that's, in the mention of the description of the top, I mean, her grandmother, and we'll talk more about the Marches here in a bit, but her grandmother basically steps off her boat into the depths below. And that's not only a terrible thing in people's minds because it seems like she has, she's ended her own life and she's chosen to basically throw her into the depths below, but it's also seen as a selfish act because her bones are what should eventually be what power one of these ships, and she's taken away a precious resource by doing this. And that is something where people have to shake their heads and be like, no, you can't do that. And I thought that was a pretty fascinating concept to kind of explore there, because people would talk about, I mean, and granted, it's always hard to figure out where you hit like a trigger warning as far as talking about things like people taking their own lives. But that's a constant conversation around it, is that, it's an act of selfishness and the pushback on those ideas. But here in this world, that's literally, there's a more concrete reason to speak that way because she's pulling a resource out of that world. So, I think that's definitely worth noting in there. Well, let's dig into Kindred and the Marches here then, because the her grandmother, who I'm referring to as the Marches here, is this venerable ship's captain, has her own ability with hearthfire as well. At the beginning of the story, they're on the outs and have been for a couple of years, and discovering that her grandmother has gone missing. I mean, everybody thinks that she's dead, but that's not necessarily what she comes to find or believe. So Kindred, that changes the shape of her life and where she's going. Can you kind of tell me, when we know that she's a dropout from school, and we know that she's a square peg in a round hole of rules and that the way her role in society is designed, how does these changes motivate her, and what does this push her on to?
So Kindred's story, Kindred lost her parents when she was very young. And one of the things that I really didn't want to do with this book was to do a kind of dead parent story, a sort of, I constantly live in the shadow of who my parents were and that sort of thing. And I don't have anything against those stories. I didn't feel like I had anything to add about that sort of a story. And so Kindred loses her parents and gets taken in by her grandmother. And we were talking about tropes earlier. And I think probably a trope that I really gravitate towards often unconsciously is the kind of crazy old person who's awesome trope. And that's the Marchess. So she's like kind of crazy. She's pretty weird, but she's also very good at what she does, and is part of this kind of old guard of captains who sailed kind of under a different regime. They sailed smaller vessels. It was less about sort of efficiency and effectiveness for them. And it was a kind of different world. And so Kindred grows up under her tutelage, grows up learning how to keep the hearthfire in this very sort of intuitive, kind of arty way, right? And she gets to a certain point where she feels like she needs to find her own way in the world, where she feels like I'm sort of living under the shadow of my grandmother, and I need to make my own way. I need to leave an impact or sort of leave an impression on the world that's mine. And so she leaves her grandmother's ship and starts keeping the hearthfires, kind of the junior hearthfire keeper, on this vessel called the Errant. And so when her grandmother leaves, when she disappears, we'll leave it sort of vague that way. She's very torn, right? She feels like this is the person who raised me, and in many ways, I'm sort of living her legacy, right? I'm like her in lots of ways, but I also tried to break with her in this sort of clear, obvious way. And so it's a real moment of kind of decision for her, where she has to decide, who do I want to be, and what do I want my life to be? And it gets into a big theme that I was really interested in for this book, which is like, what do you do when you're part of a community, one you love, but your own sort of dreams or ideas are pushing you in a different direction? And so I grew up in a really big family. I have 10 brothers and sisters, and went very far away for college, and then even further away for graduate school, and always felt like I was doing the wrong thing, right? That I should have been sort of turning inward as opposed to looking outward. But I had this kind of drive to sort of go out and see stuff. And I felt this real sort of push and pull. And so I wanted Kindred to be a character who felt really at home in this community of other sailors on this vessel. And the book starts with her really becoming a member of that community in a sort of serious way, but then having this sort of individual drive to do something else that seems kind of crazy or insane or risky, and that puts her in some really rough spots.
I really identify with a lot of the stuff you said there. In particular, because I am the youngest of 15 children. And
Whoa!
Yeah. So,
wow.
I have 10 sisters and 4 brothers. And I am also that person who has steered away in a lot of ways from the shape of the lives. My life is very dissimilar to a lot of them in a lot of ways. And while I love all my siblings, I don't identify with them in a massive way most of the time, and live a life fairly separately from them. So I get all of that, and I can see those threads there in the narrative. So I don't know. There's gonna be a lot of us that are from that particular specific demographic of like giant, family to that thing, but I'm sure those themes will resonate with a lot of people regardless. There's a framing device in this story. I mentioned earlier that there's a prologue, and it's a banger of a prologue. But it starts off with this character called the storyteller, who is initially in the story, we get hints of the fact that the storyteller is perhaps not entirely alive, not entirely dead, not entirely of this world, but is roaming the world telling this one specific story. And that story is the story of Kindred, but it seems to be below the depths. It seems to be in a world away from the sun, very far below, maybe very far in the future. As framing devices go, man, I'm into that. I really dig everything about that. But I'm curious as to where that particular character and that framing device and that entire POV, where did that arrive in the writing process? Was that something that came early on? Did it develop later? And how did that affect your approach to the rest of the narrative?
I wish I could say it was my beautiful brainchild right from the beginning, but in fact, it only appeared after we had sold the novel. And one of the themes that I'm sort of working on in the novel is about like how myth works to kind of shape how we feel about the world around us. And one of my editors had this idea that my other editor really sort of went with about like, is there a way that we can make Kindred's story feel much more mythic and much bigger? And the idea was a sort of frame narrative to offer readers an introduction to the world in a different way, but also to, the storyteller is like Kindred's hype man, essentially. And so a very weird, somewhat strange, perhaps not entirely living hype man. And so, so it came very late. And in some ways, I think I was lucky that it came late because I could write it with much more confidence, already knowing what the plot was and what the shape of the story was. I think if I had written it beforehand, it would have probably looked very different. And I don't know that it would have been as effective. It's been one of the challenges of working on book 2 is thinking about how that frame narrative works as I'm creating it alongside the second book, which is, it's sort of done now, at least a draft of it is done. But it was a really different experience writing those two in tandem, as opposed to sort of looking over the whole of the book and thinking, how could I sort of play with some of these things that are already on the page, or how could I allude to this or really heighten this? One of the things that I love about frame narratives is they sort of allow you to cheat a little bit and talk quite directly to the reader and introduce somewhat arbitrary breaks in the action. And so we were talking about info dumps earlier. One of the ways that I try and do info dumps is just like giving them to the storyteller to sort of say, which in some ways feels like cheating, but it's also how we tell stories. Yeah, I think it's a really versatile tool in a lot of ways. It also breaks up the narrative and sort of gives this broader sense of purpose. It is also, I think, a really big promise to a reader, right? I think if you set something at a different time or a different place, there's the expectation that these two things will collide or conjoin or come together, converge in some interesting way, right? And so, yeah, one of the challenges has been thinking about what's the most interesting and powerful way I could make good on that promise. I don't want to say too much more, but
well, payoffs matter. You mentioned Lost earlier, and it made me think of my wife and I's Christmas Eve. This will make sense in a second. Our Christmas Eve tradition is to watch the Community episode Abed's Uncontrollable Christmas. And
I love that episode.
Yes, it's fantastic. And he goes deep into his own psychology, trying to figure out the things he's dealing with. And he eventually opens up this box that's like 9 boxes over and over again. And finally it's a DVD collection of the first season of Lost. And they're like, what? And he's like, it represents lack of payoff. and it destroys me every time. I love it so much. And it's so great about what that show says. But yeah, it's like you were saying earlier, you're presenting a promise to the reader. And one of the things that people grab onto in a story, at least I do as somebody who kind of likes to work whenever I'm reading a novel, is you're trying to piece those things together. Where is this going to come together? If you introduce two separate POVs that don't know each other, you expect they're going to collide sometime, whether it's this novel or 9 down the way, depending on what kind of epic fantasy you're writing or whatever. Where's this going to come together and how does this make sense? And we kind of, in lives where things don't tie off neatly, we want our fiction to have some element of that. We want things to feel like there's a logic at the base of them and that there's a plan and things make sense, because just like real life going on right now, a lot of it doesn't at all. So I'm also curious to know, I mean, like you said, I mean, the first novel, the storyteller came later, so you were approaching it a completely different way in the second book. What does your writing process look like now? You said that the second draft is done, or the second novel's first draft is done, turned into your editor.
Right.
So the first book, I mean, The Forever Sea is a debut novel. Doesn't mean it's the first thing you wrote by any means, but it's the debut novel.
Yeah.
But the second one, writing under contract, writing under deadline, writing under expectation, that's a whole other animal. So what did that feel like for you? Did your writing evolve much in the process? How did editorial work? All that stuff.
Yeah, writing under all of those things and during a pandemic was incredibly difficult. You can see there some of my process. I had to do much more outlining for this one than I did with the Forever Sea, in part because I just had less time to do it. The Forever Sea took a long time. It took, I don't know, it's been about over 4 years since I started writing it. And so I went through many drafts, and I could have drafts where I was just kind of farting around and figuring out what this character was going to do, or if this plot line really paid off, or something like that. And this time there was much more expectation for me personally to kind of get it right, not on the first try, but as close to the first try as I could get it. And my editors have been really great with this. I mean, they're super understanding, but I sort of wanted to sort of stay in the heat of the book, or I don't know, that's a bad way of saying it. I feel like when you're writing a book, you can get into a kind of momentum and into a kind of zone with it. And I had that coming off of working on final edits for the Forever Sea. And so I really wanted to carry that forward and not lose the thread. And so I felt like I really had to stick with it. What it mostly meant for me was every morning I would get up early. So my wife and I have a 4-year-old, now 4-year-old. She was 3 at the time. I should first of all say, like, I couldn't write without my wife, who is like an incredible reader, but also is like super supportive. And when you have a kid who's that young, you can't just say like, just leave me alone for a while so I can play in my imaginary world. My wife would take our daughter for the first couple hours of the day from 5 to 9 or something like that. And I would sit down and sort of hammer it out. And what it looked like was a ton of outlining, a ton of like storyboarding like this, frantic calls with writer friends to say like, this isn't working. Why isn't it working? And them saying, it's going to be fine. Just calm down and figure it out, and things like that. But I think the biggest thing for me was this real sense of like, there needs to be some payoff for the stuff that I've done. And for me, that's where a lot of the sort of tension of writing came in, is either what if readers figure it out already, right? So I kept asking like, what if the reveal that I have planned for page 400, a reader figures out on page 200, right? Does that mean I sort of lose 200 pages of value? I thought a lot about that HBO series True Detective, and how going into the last episode of the first season, one of the writers or maybe the director said like, there's no spoilers, or there's no like big reveals coming. You know what's going to happen. There's no sort of, and it was this guy all along or something. And I remember thinking like, that's a really bold move for a writer to say like, there are no surprises coming, right? You know what's about to happen. And if that's the case, where's the sort of fun and excitement and power? And is there a way to write a story that even if somebody figures it out early, there's real sort of value and power they can get during the quote unquote reveal? And so for me, it came into sort of much of my anxiety and sort of tension and worry and fear was around that, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think, in the era post Hitchcock, there's this sense that everything has to have a twist. There has to be a big reveal. There has to be a like, oh my God, kind of moment that maybe is problematic at this point, because I think that narratives have to get wackier and twistier and more obfuscated, and that there's something to be said for being able to recognize that things have a logical, inevitable, trajectory once things kind of get set in motion. Sometimes if we're surprised, it's because the wool's been pulled over on us, not because something happened the way it should happen. I love that there's a Joe Abercrombie book where the twist is that nothing happens at the end, where it gets to the big MacGuffin at the end and there's no payoff and everybody just has to go home. And that going home sets up the next novel. But I remember getting to it and being like, oh, this ending is going to make people so mad. And I love it. I love it so
Yeah.
much because I just had never seen anybody do that before. Yeah, it's good. It's such a challenge and trying to figure out what
Yeah.
your expectations are going to be and stuff. You mentioned in there, you definitely outlined. I can see that, you've got the post-it notes and stuff up there too. So I'm curious, do you have a specific plotting system, anything that you have kind of adhered to? And then also just what are your tools of the trade alongside the, the Wallow post-it notes there?
Yeah. Yeah, I should say some of these are from my daughter as well. And so if you're doing like the zoom in screen and you're trying to look at some of them and they just have like G's written on them, it's because she's working on her letters. It's not because I am, well, maybe I'm working on my letters too. Yeah, so I do this. So I went to the Odyssey writing workshop a couple of years ago. That's actually where the idea for this story came from. And the instructor there, Gene Cavellos, talks a lot about act structure, and that's been really useful for me. So I think in terms of bigger act structure, but pretty loosely. I'm not especially committed to it. And outside of that, I don't really have much of a plotting plan or a drafting plan. I just try to like lean on having been a reader for a lot of my life and hoping that a lot of that stuff is intuitive, and then also knowing that like I have really good editors who will very nicely but firmly let me know that this thing that I have just written is terrible and it needs to be changed in these ways. So I sort of do that. Outside of post-it notes, I have like notebooks everywhere in my house that are like half filled with random doodles and chicken scratches. And then I write in Scrivener, which I like a lot. I think I probably use about 15% of its real capabilities, but I like it a lot. Yeah.
That's a conversation happens a lot in here is one, just, I mean, Scrivener is such an amazing tool, but inevitably you don't use everything in it. When I talked to, I mentioned Cass Morris earlier in the episode, and when she was on here, she was talking about this metadata stuff that you could do on top of every like, section and page of it, whatever. So you could easily search it later for characters or certain tags, whatever. And I was just, I had no idea that was even in there. And I'm like, oh, that's going to change everything. And yet I still haven't even looked up how to do it yet. So,
well, I just learned how to do like session targets, and I felt like I had conquered the world when I figured that out. So I feel like metadata is like eons away from me. So I get it. Yeah, I'm with you.
I didn't know there were session targets either. So yeah, so I mean, we can all learn something in here.
Yeah, we can crowdsource this. Yeah.
Well, like I said at the top, I mean, as we're talking, we're a couple of weeks away from the novel coming out on January 19th. I'm not sure when the episode lands off the top of my head, so I think it comes out probably a couple of days after. So this book is probably available by the time that people will be watching and listening to this episode. So they should go out and get themselves some of that, whether through any of the online shopping places where it is available. And for the people who are, viewing this on the YouTube, it'll be down in the comments, the links to all the different places, or in the show notes for the people who are listening to the podcast. Where should people be following you so that they can learn more about you as an author, more about the works that you have coming up, and then just can kind of get into your ecosystem and know what's going on?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on Twitter, I would say. I'm at Johnson Joshua P. And I also have a website that I update somewhat regularly, and I think will update much more once the book is out and I have actual things to update about. And that is joshuaphillipjohnson.com. Josh Johnson and joshuajohnson.com were both taken, shockingly. So I had to go for the whole name. So those are the two places to follow me. If you follow me on Twitter, you're going to get a good mixture of book stuff and then weird shit that my daughter says. So these are the two poles of my life that I swing between. So
I will say that there is an entire entertaining genre of Twitter that is people just talking about the cryptic, weird crap that their children say, and then having to deal with it afterwards and figuring out, like, should I be afraid for my life? Did they just summon Cthulhu? What is happening here? Yeah. I wish there was a dedicated hashtag to make it easier to find, because as a non-parent, I mean, I don't have kids, so I just have my dog to keep me laughing and, to keep me and my wife entertained. But like that's a wonderful genre of entertainment on the tweets. So yeah, like I said, the Forever Sea, start of, I believe it's also the Forever Sea, the series name as well. Keeping it easy on us. I'm here for that. Yeah. And so people should go check that out. Like I said, this is innovative world building in a very interesting setting that was really fresh and exciting for me to jump into. I encourage people, if nothing else, just like go to where you buy your ebooks, pull up that first prologue chapter and read that, and kind of get a sense of what you're in for. And I think people will be sold. So go get you some of that. And Josh, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thanks for having me. It was great.